thank you both for doing this. I really enjoyed it. So Valerie, my question seems a little bit off topic, but I'm curious, and I know it's not your area of expertise, and it has to do with creation. If you look at astrophysicists today, who are professed secular humanists, they're scientists who want to understand the origin of the universe. They will all agree that it takes a very specific sequence of things to happen in order to create the circumstances or the parameters for the creation of the universe. And I'm just curious what you think about the creation of the universe and what your speculation is as to how that actually happened.
Thanks. So before I answer that question at all, which I'm not going to be able to answer in any detail, I just have to say I'm feeling very territorial about that lemon bar over there. So while I'm stuck on the stage, you all just need to stay behind the microphone. It's the best lemon bar I've had in a long time. So to your question, you're right. It's outside of my area of expertise, and so I'm not even going to make an attempt to delve into kind of hypotheses about physics. Coming at it from my perspective as a psychologist, I just think one thing we need to be careful of, I think people talk about sort of like, wow, the constants of the universe are just right for us to exist in this universe that's called, I think, the anthropic principle or whatever. And I think we just have to be careful because it's easy to fall into the kind of thinking that is like, you know, wow, my foot is perfectly made for this sock, as opposed to, you know, kind of thinking about the reverse, wow, the sock was actually made to shape my foot, to fit my foot, right? And so I think because of our tendency to place ourselves at the center of kind of everything, that it's easy to kind of fall into the kind of thinking that says, wow, this universe was perfectly optimized for us, as opposed to thinking that we are kind of like perfectly optimized for this universe in some way.
Thank you, Valerie. Something I forgot to say, if you want to stand at the microphone while the person answers your question, Luuk or Valerie, just in case they want to have further interaction with you, you're welcome to do that until your question's been answered. Then you have to go to the back of the line again. The next question for Luuk.
Okay. Why have the Christians warred to such an extent if Jesus/Christianity embraces love?
Why did Christians? Oh, you mean as in like
the wars,
the Crusades, and etc.
WARS.
Okay. Yes, I think that's an excellent question. Now, when you say wars, do you mean which? Could you be a little more specific? Do you have a particular wars in mind?
All the wars that have been fought in the name of Christianity.
Okay, in the name of Christianity. Okay, because my first response would be, I think in most of our systems of ethics, there are conditions for just war. And so I think you can have Christian principles that regulate how you treat your neighbor, how you love your neighbor as yourself, how you turn the other cheek. But I think many Christians, not all, but many, would consider a proper situation where violence would be justified in a certain just war theory. But you're talking specifically about things, I'm guessing, like crusades, inquisitions, just evils done in the name of Christianity. So I'll respond to that then. I think this is the first thing I would want to make very clear. You can't judge a philosophy or a system of belief by its abuse. And so the first way that I would respond was those evils done during Christendom, the Middle Ages, etc., you have to ask yourself, are those reflections of the teachings of Jesus, or are those the reflections of the actions of people who may have never even read their Bibles, or who may have misunderstood the teachings of Jesus, or who may have simply misused Jesus' name and are hypocrites? And so that's where I would begin. And so I would say, when you look at the person of Jesus himself, that's where Christians ought to be pulling their ethics from. And when you look at Jesus, the things he taught us about forgiveness, self-sacrifice, turning the other cheek, and loving one another, I think that's a profound and beautiful system by which we ought to live by. But just because some Christians, fail to do so doesn't mean we should reject Christianity, right?
Okay, next question for Valerie.
Thank you. If we are to follow your suggestion that we not make our minds the center of the world and approach these questions with humility, are we not then required to accept the possibility that Christ was in fact resurrected, and that the people who spread that word, who wrote the Gospels, and who died for that belief were not mistaken, were not con men, and were not hallucinating?
We're certainly, I think, required to accept that possibility, but being psychologically healthy means living in a world of probabilities, not a world of possibilities. And if I apply that principle to the question that you just asked, what I think is that we find ourselves in a world of evidences and reasons and hypotheses and a bunch of, I guess, whatever that, in which the kind of what you just suggested is fairly improbable. So that would be my answer to it. Do you want to, does that answer your question?
Not quite, because then aren't you not assuming that the people who wrote the gospel, then you're assuming there's a greater probability, are you not, that the people who wrote the gospels, that Paul, the people who died on the belief that Christ was resurrected, you're saying there's a greater probability that they're either lying or hallucinating or are mistaken than that what they're saying happened did in fact happen. Are you not?
Do you assume that the existence of jihadis is evidence for the proof of that the Quran is true?
This is a question regarding Christianity first. If we can answer this, we could talk about the Quran another occasion. So,
Let me tell you why I asked that. I asked that because you framed the question in a way that suggested that, right? That suggested that the existence of belief, kind of, or even broad acceptance of belief, impassioned belief, the willingness to sacrifice one's life is a sort of evidence that would kind of mean that it's probable that it's true, or that it's improbable that it's false. And I would question that.
Thank you. Next question for Luuk.
Luuk,
Hi, Bob.
hey, you said something toward the end that I wanted to compliment you on. This was on the topic of C.S. Lewis's Trial, I'm a Liar, Lunatic, or Lord, and you said that that really is kind of constrained, that legend, for starters, would be a fourth option. You also said that you talked about, the Bible says this, and how is this possible without the supernatural explanation, and supernatural explanation just neatly answers these questions, etc. But when you put those two together, wouldn't legend very nicely explain the resurrection, the empty tomb, all the stories that you have there, given that, of course, these things were documented 40 years, let's say, after the fact?
Yeah, well, I don't think legend explains the historical facts that you find not just in the Gospels, but in the Pauline epistles, and that we have in the creedal statements in, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, and then that going back to, I hate to bring up Bar Ehrman again, but according to Bar Ehrman, E.P. Sanders as well, that go back to John Dominic Crossan, that go back to within 2 years of the resurrection. So even they will say, you can look at the Pauline letters, which predate the Gospels, and you have a claim of resurrection, physical bodily resurrection of Jesus within a couple years of his death. And so just the fact that you have that, I think removes any idea that this is some kind of myth from the outside world for a number of reasons. First, there was no concept of physical bodily resurrection anywhere in the ancient world. And so you have to ask yourself, where would they come up with this idea? Why would they come up with this idea? Then furthermore, you have guys like James, the brother of Jesus, that's how he's referred to, and in Josephus, and most scholars agree that is James, the brother of Jesus, simply because there is no one else who really fits the category of who that might be, James the Just, during that time, a well-respected leader in Jerusalem. You have these kind of people dying for Jesus. These are the facts, and I'm just mentioning a couple now, right? And then you have to say, what best describes these facts? And this is not even beginning to touch on the historicity of the Gospels. I've just looked at the Pauline epistles, I've just looked at Josephus, and that's why a lot of these even skeptical scholars say we have these facts. We can't just ignore them, right? How do you explain them? And then that's where I insert this, my theory, I guess you could call it that, the supernatural best explains that. And that's, I think, where I would begin to answer that question. Do you kind of get where I'm going with this?
Thank you.
Before I take a question for Valerie, I would like to invite anybody that wants to ask Luke, that thinks they can put him on the spot, to come. Okay, next question for Valerie.
I got a real quick, easy yes and no question. And my question is, the first sentence in the Bible says, God created all the heavens and the earth, period. And which I believe very, very much, that's, and I just wonder if you agree with that. If you don't, why not?
No, I don't believe that. And because I don't personally believe that that the created order, that the natural world provides evidence of some kind of intelligence that would be in any way comprehensible to us as human beings. I also, it seems fairly clear to me, as it does to a number of other people, that there are two very distinct creation stories in the book of Genesis that were bound together, but that actually emerged from two different traditions, and which I guess is a different question, but it, I guess, relates to the question of whether that opening chapter of Genesis is credible testament to how the world was actually created.
Luke, you stated that meaninglessness comes from a weariness with pleasure. Now, I think I've gone down that road once myself. I had a nearly new Corvette, and let me tell you, socializing, I had a lot more fun with an old panel truck, more social, more romance, you name it.
Okay.
I would suggest, or I would ask, if you think it's possible, even probable, that meaninglessness comes. No, first that was before I heard the statement, you can never get enough of what you don't need. I would suggest that meaninglessness comes from our concept of mortality and from not having real community. I don't mean just some people we go to church on weekend or something. In an acommunal society, that there's that longing. And that seems to be really probable to me, very likely, that that's where that really comes from. And I would like to ask you what you think about that possibility.
Oh, okay.
No, probability, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, as far as it comes to fulfilling that longing for more, that's kind of how I put it, something more to life, etc. I think there are people who, it seems to me, I look at Valerie, who have ambition, who see a higher purpose of their lives without God. My response, I'll just give a couple of responses. I think first I would say, when it comes to the argument for the resurrection, I put that all the way at the end, because really the way that I see it is, if the resurrection is true, then that desire that we have for transcendence, for morality, for something beyond ourselves, for that to be something concrete, eternal, really significant in the big picture, I think you do need some kind of hope in a resurrection or some kind of hope in God to make it real. Because the reality is, are you an atheist?
Pardon?
Are you an atheist?
Actually, an agnostic, a secular humanist, and a secular Christian.
Yeah.
I like Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. Anything you fail to do for my people, the least of my people, you failed for me. Those are good words.
Yeah.
But I don't believe in a hereafter, and I do not believe that Jesus was the Son of God.
Okay.
He said some really neat things.
Okay. So this is the way that I see it then. So if you want purpose to be real meaning, things to really have significance in the big picture, how do you get that if ultimately all of us are just the reality of a purposeless process that ends in the heat death of the universe? right? Because, I mean, face it, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, what are all of us except rotting in the ground and the memories and the memories and the memories of our dead children? I mean, that's, and if this life is all there is, sure, you can make up a meaning out of that, but it isn't real. That's it isn't real. I mean, sure, you can say you value community and et cetera, but ultimately, what does that, I mean, what does it mean, ultimately?
Yeah, question, but the weariness of pleasure. I think Native Americans who consider 7 generations in the future often are happier people. A lot of indigenous people really happier, have less, and are happy. We're trapped in, it seems to me we're trapped into wanting more and more things. Hey, I've done that. That didn't work real well. But the longing I have as I've gotten older, and I'm quite old now, is the connection with other people. I think that's what it means to be human. My philosophy is based on anthropology. But what about that weariness of pleasure? I don't see an awful lot of pleasure in this culture right here. I see a lot of pain. 95% of people wouldn't work at their jobs if they won the lottery. So, I mean, I kind of feel like you haven't answered my question. The weariness of pleasure. Pleasure, I'm not talking about hedonistic pleasure, but the pleasure of just having people in your lives that love you and you love them, in a community that looks out for each other.
Yeah.
And it seems to me those are things, and there are plenty of Christians who value that. I'm an atheist, basically, who says, I wish there were more real Christians in this world.
Yeah.
Even though, you know, because I care more what people do than what they say or what they believe.
Okay.
So what about that weariness of pleasure? I have difficulty with that. So
okay, I see. So
what do you think about? That's the issue for me.
Okay.
That's what I'm asking about.
Yeah, I think you and I, and maybe this is just going back to that G.K. Chesterton quote. It's obviously, it's like a little proverb, more like, right? It's just a general statement. So if you look at, I think what he's trying to say is, not for everybody, but just as a general consensus, if you look at even people who have everything, right? At the end of the day, there's still this desire for something more, right? Something beyond ourselves. And I think that's really all that he's saying. I don't think he's saying it's some kind of natural law that we all have that. I don't deny that you, it seems like you're able to find happiness and pleasure in what you're doing. So I think I would just, in a sense, almost agree with you. It's not, I'm not saying this is a universal principle we all have, et cetera. I just kind of meant it more as something to think about, you know. And I think a lot of people do sense that emptiness for something more, and they do find it in a transcendent God. Even when they have things like community and success and family, I think there's something deeper to us, even beyond those things. Because we realize if there is no God, this is just one massive oven of a universe that's going nowhere, right? And so if we want that desire for transcendence to really be something real, I think you need to have something transcendent that makes sense of that.
I guess I'd agree if it, empty pleasure, and a lot of that is, that's not really satisfying.
Yeah. So
anyway.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot for bringing that up.
Thank you. Question for Valerie.
Before I ask my question, I'd first like to say thank you to both of you for a very respectful, well-mannered debate. In this day and age of polarization, it's very difficult to find sort of a reasonable, sane conversation on religious matters and things like that. So thank you for providing us a model there. My question, Valerie, regards some comments that were made during the first speech of yours, in which you were discussing unreached convergences and the nature of faith and knowing. And I wonder if you could clarify a little bit more about reasons for rejecting traditional religious responses. So what I mean by that is, in one case, you mentioned that members of one religious community will have a feeling of certainty about the truth of their religious beliefs, whereas others in a very different religious community will have the exact same feeling of gut-level certainty. But I wonder how one gets from an awareness of that simultaneous certainty across different religions to a position where one rejects the possibility of truth in either of these religions. Because it seems to me that a subjective state of certainty could attach itself to any kind of belief, whether true or false. And so I'm just wondering if you could sort of explain the transition from the widespread disagreement to sort of the rejection of religious beliefs.
You almost have 14 commas and clauses.
But it's a great question. It's a great question. Let me kind of address the question of certainty, which there's a book that, if you are interested in this, the kind of neurology of it, there's a book called On Being Certain. And what neurologists are coming to kind of realize is that our sense of being certain is actually an emotion. And when people have certain kinds of brain damage, they can't formulate a sense of certainty, right? So under certain conditions, a person might just spend 10 hours researching restaurants and have all of the information laid out in front of them, and they can't make a decision because they never get that gut feeling of knowing, and which I think is fascinating. What we know is that simultaneously that their person can have information and not trigger the sense of knowing, and obviously we very often experience the sense of knowing when in fact we are wrong. As it relates to religion, what I think this lack of convergence lets us know is that faith is a poor epistemology, right? That what we know, for example, with the scientific method, where you're forced to engage in a question of a process of falsification, where you're forced to actually ask the questions that would show you wrong, that we over time reach convergence, that somebody can be wrong, but they can't be wrong for 1,000 years, and the same thing with kind of, so basic, but the fact is that with faith, people are able to kind of maintain those differences over extended time periods without any process of convergence, and so I think that honestly that calls into question the value of faith itself as a way of knowing. And so then that leads us to apply some of the same methods that have helped us to gain, has helped humanity to amass knowledge in other areas, apply that to the same kinds of questions that we think about as being religious questions, so questions of our origins, etc. And basically what that means is, instead of asking confirmatory questions, asking the questions that could show us wrong. And if you apply those same kinds of rigorous standards to questions that have typically been answered via faith, what you come up is with a lack of evidence and the inability to make affirmatory statements of the kinds that are typically made by religions.
Thank you.
Question for Luuk.
Thank you both for being here. Luuk, Valerie commented on the substitution for what Christians call sin, saying if one murdered, how would it be right for their sister to take on that for their own? Could we have your comment on that?
Yeah, and I think that is a really difficult concept for us to grasp, because that's not something that can happen in our judicial system. You can't take the death penalty for someone else or God. The entire situation is very different, because God is, according to the Christian worldview, my beliefs as well, that God is the foundation of our moral duty. It's ultimately to him that all people are called to give an account. God is the moral judge. And that even trickles down to, like I said, in the Christian worldview, even how we treat one another. We are called to treat one another with dignity and respect because we're made in God's image, right? So even morality on the horizontal level really goes back to God, right? Why is it wrong to murder, to steal, etc.? Because you're defacing God's image. You're undermining the dignity of another person who's made in God's image. So all of morality comes back to the God to whom we're accountable and says he is king, he is judge. If he says the way to be forgiven is by me incarnating myself and paying for your sin, that my holiness might still be intact, that my glory might be revealed, that my mercy might be revealed. I mean, think about if Jesus' death on the cross is what Christians claim it is, our payment for sin. Sure, you can look at that and say, what a horrible thing. But the way I look at it as a Christian is I say, what an incredible thing. You have at that moment of history, that dark, ugly place outside Jerusalem, a crucified Messiah, that moment in time, the very attributes of the living God who made the universe, his mercy, his justice, his grace, kissed on that cross. They came together. And so I just take a different perspective and I say, wow, if the resurrection is real, that's true. And to me, that's remarkable. So I just take a different perspective on it, I guess.
Thank you.
Question for Valerie.
Okay, Valerie. Simple question. Do you believe in a creator?
I don't know how to even answer that question, right? Do I believe that we exist? Yes. Do I believe that there was some kind of process that brought us into existence? Of course, right? So what do you mean by a creator?
Not evolution, not a naturalistic process, but something supernatural that could bring about the physical world that we see in the universe.
I think that we tend to, if you look at humanity broadly, we create supernatural explanations when there are gaps in our natural explanations. So 2,000 years ago, kind of when kind of at the time that Jesus existed, there would have been, like supernatural explanations for comets, for illness, for storms, for all kinds of things, droughts, right? And what happens is that over time, as we develop naturalistic explanations for those things, the sphere of supernatural explanation shrinks. I also think that even to this day, humanity is very prone in a wide variety of ways to supernatural explanations, right? So there's all kinds of people who believe in one kind or another of ghosts, of miracles, not just in Christianity, but in many other kinds of religions, and sort of magic of different kinds. And so the word, I guess, supernatural to me is a placeholder for something that we don't know or we don't understand. And when you ask that in the context of creation, I mean, that's what it says to me. And so it's kind of not a meaningful term.
Okay, so what you're saying is you believe that we can't explain everything around us, and so you believe it might be the case that there's a creator, or it might not be. We just have no way of knowing yet.
I think there are things that are inherently unknown. There are things that are unknown, and there are things that are inherently unknowable. So I'm not a physicist. I don't look at the origins of the universe. There are things there are questions on which I have to say I'm agnostic, right? It's outside my domain to kind of have an educated hypothesis about how our universe came into being. I think what you're trying to ask, if there's a kind of humanoid type intelligence that created our universe, and if that's what you're asking, I think that what any kind of intelligence that would have created our universe is so alien and so beyond our comprehension that our kind of understanding of the word creator is, again, painfully ethnocentric. It's kind of centered on what we are and how our minds are shaped and what we think of as intelligence and sentient beings, which is very much a reflection of, in that sense, us creating God.
A question for Luke now.
All right, my question is, Bart Ehrman, he must be paying you guys something, or anyway. So my question for you, Luke, is if Bart Ehrman believes in the resurrection, why is he not a Christian?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Bart Ehrman affirms, just like other skeptical scholars do, affirms the facts that I laid out, and they simply refuse to come to a conclusion about where the evidence leads. They just say, I don't know. They're agnostic. And I think oftentimes they're naturalists for other reasons. So Bart Ehrman, I know from his own testimony, doesn't believe in God. He's a naturalist because of the problem of evil. And I know this is something that Valerie has struggled with as well. And I think that just highlights the fact that these are complex issues, right? And we don't come into Christianity or out of Christianity in a vacuum. We're not robots who just look at all the facts and then come to a conclusion. I think we should be, but as human beings, we are looking at it through the lens of our own experience. And I think because that's the case, we do come to different conclusions about these things. And I think cases like Bart Ehrman and other skeptics as well, that's simply the case for them. They see that evidence, and they have their own reasons for not drawing the conclusions that I think it leads to there.
So I'm sorry, before you ask your question, Luke, I have to ask you a question because I think there was a misunderstanding in that. My understanding is that Bart Ehrman does not believe in the resurrection. It's that he's agnostic on the question of what created the stories of the resurrection. Is that not an accurate way to put it?
I'll try to be clear about where I don't want to say I know, but where I confidently think Bart Ehrman is coming from. I think he is saying, having read a few of his books, he's saying the fact that the disciples had what they thought to be experiences of the risen Jesus, that's a fact. Kind of like what you were saying, I think you were right. The facts of history are the appearances, the empty tomb, and scholars will debate that, the change of lifestyle. These are the facts of history, right? And then you have to ask yourself what explains those facts of history. And I think Bart Ehrman would say, these are the facts, sure, like early transformed lives, Peter, James, Paul, etc., transformed lives, empty tomb. I don't think he would say empty tomb, but the appearances are the facts. And then he would say, I refuse to accept the fact that the resurrection explains them. And he'll say very openly, I don't know what explains them, but I just refuse to say it's the resurrection. So does that clarify anything? Yeah? Maybe.
Guess we're all going to have to read more Bart Ehrman. No, I mean, I think he is saying that. I think he is saying that there are things that we don't know about the origins of the kind of what put in motion those changes that kind of then set off the kind of birth of Christianity.
I think, and I'll just draw a distinction, this might be a little bit helpful. I think when it comes to the origin of the Gospels, clearly, I mean, Bart Ehrman argues that these were anonymous, etc. I'm sure you're familiar with all this, misquoting Jesus and stuff like that. So when it comes to the Gospels, he says the origins, specific origins of these stories, we don't know. He literally argues they're anonymous. But when it comes to the facts about Jesus' bodily appearances, he doesn't deny those on other grounds, like the Pauline epistles, especially. It's like 1 Corinthians 15 that has that resurrection creed. And he, along with other scholars, will say, this is an authentic Pauline letter. We know this. It's from the early 50s. We also have Galatians, which we also know to be authentic from Paul, in which Paul says to the Galatian church, hey, listen, I became a Christian. We're looking at 32, 33 AD. What I did then was I met with James, I met with Peter, and then they put that story together, and they say, where did Paul get this creed that he writes in 1 Corinthians in the year 50 AD? It's a creedal statement about the resurrection. And most scholars will say the most logical place for Paul to get that creed was when he met with James and Peter in Jerusalem a couple years after the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's why, on those kind of grounds, he says, well, if you just look at Galatians and 1 Corinthians, apparently people were preaching the resurrection within a couple years of Jesus' death. Paul believed it, Peter believed it, James believed it, and then you have some of the most astounding transformed lives right there in the Pauline epistles. That he would just go to other sources in the Gospels, I think.
Yeah, I guess in my mind it's a little muddier than that, and obviously, but I'm going to move on to this next question. Thank you, actually, and thank you for your patience.
Do you have any children?
I have 2.
Can you explain to me, I'm sure that you've had an experience where you've not been around your children, but you knew something was going on, a supernatural, right?
I've also had the experience of not being around my brother and knowing that something bad had happened to him, and it hadn't.
We're talking about your children. Have you had an experience where you felt something was going on? You felt maybe your kid was crying in the crib and you were in the other room, whatever, something like that.
I've never had an experience that I thought was inexplicable in natural terms. Is that what you're asking?
I'm saying that there are supernatural things that happen on this earth that there is no explanation. You can't explain it. Luke can't explain it. The only explanation is it's supernatural. There's people that have feelings. Just about any woman that I've ever talked to that's had a child will admit to me that, oh my gosh, my kid was in school and I just knew something happened. Being a psychologist, you deal with this.
Yeah.
How can you explain supernatural?
Well, one of the ways I explain, first of all, I'm not saying I wouldn't say I have an explanation for everything. What I would say is that I don't necessarily make supernatural attributions when I don't have an explanation. One of the things that we know about human beings is that we very strongly engage in confirmatory thinking. And so in those situations in which we have a premonition and then it turns out to be correct, we are far more likely to retain that in memory than we are the situations in which we have a similar kind of premonition and it turns out to be inaccurate. And so we kind of over time build up a memory bank of things that confirm, for example, the idea that our premonitions are accurate. And I don't know that that's the whole explanation, but it's certainly part of it.
So you're saying you don't believe in supernatural, or you do?
I am saying I do not.
You do not.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you. I'm going to
Thank
go on
you.
to another question. And we're going to start winding down here. I'll see how many more we can fit in. Your question for Luke.
I want to thank both of you and the audience. I'm very impressed that people are not booing or yaying and everything and listening very accurately. I personally feel I'm 75, and when I was going to college, I worked in a local hospital because I came from a poor family and witnessed a lot of people, family rushing to a doctor or something, and this one's died. And in terms of what is life and death is continually evolving in medicine. It would not surprise me that back then when you're referring to the resurrection, he might have been living. And then he awakened very weakly, and if I were in his position, I wouldn't want to stay around because they're probably going to want to pull me right back and do this again. Mm-hmm. So they whisked them away. The people back then were not as savvy as we are about life, etc. I also have friends that and I know in Ayurvedic medicine, you can touch somebody somewhere and it'll knock them out and they look dead. So please answer that.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with a quote from John Dominic Crossan. He's a skeptical scholar. He says, the fact that Jesus was crucified is about as strong of a historical fact as you can get. I mean, it's just so well established that Jesus was crucified. And that's also confirmed. All the Gospels confirm it. All Paul's letters confirm it, of course, the early church fathers, even Josephus. Jesus died on a cross, a Roman cross. No one survives crucifixion, right? But let's just say somehow Jesus survived crucifixion. Okay, he comes down from the cross. He visits, the women at the empty tomb. How's Jesus going to look? He's not going to look like a glorified, resurrected Savior. He's going to really need some medical attention fast. It's not going to cause these people who followed him to change their mind, to change the very way they live, to proclaim a glorious Savior. That's absolutely not the result it would have. So I think that's just a couple of the reasons why I think trying to explain away Jesus' death is, you can't even get off the ground with that hypothesis. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, a question for Valerie.
Now that you have rejected Christianity, what do you believe will happen when you die? Why? And why does your life have meaning?
So I believe that we each get one precious life, and that when I die, I will become the part of the cycle of life here on this planet. What I find fantastic about living this life is, it's a constant source of wonder to me that I feel like the universe is made minutely conscious in each of us, that we each get to experience the wonder of the complexity of the web of life and the kind of universe beyond this web of life here on Earth. I also think that it's an incredible thing, not that a purpose is dictated or imposed on any of us, but that we each get to choose our purpose in life and decide what it means to make meaning out of our own lives. And for me, that meaning comes from a sense of service, of being able to give back in some way to this web of life that gave me birth, giving to the people around me, bringing joy and wonder into their lives, being able to have there be a little bit less, more happiness and a little bit less pain in the world by virtue of my having been here. Those are the things that I find meaning and joy in.
All right, we'll try and finish up with these two questions here, starting with you for Luke.
Yeah, hi, Luke.
Hey.
I look at the statement on the brochure, should I embrace or reject it? Okay. I was born into a Christian family. I have no problem with embracing that which is in my family and my community and try to go along with that, because people all around the world embrace that into which they are born. Okay? At a very young age, I think I was probably 5 or 6, I had one of my first major questions about Christianity. And I think it came from the standpoint of I felt that it was very kind of an unfair, not maybe unfair isn't the word, but not a very loving, well, the teachings of the church were not, the actions of the church were not showing the love which is professed by the message. And that turned me away as just a little child from believing everything that the church would say to me. So I envisioned as a child, and wisdom comes from the mouths of children sometimes, like you were saying with your kids. And what is it that, how can I overcome this cruelty in my thought that the church has, say, toward other religions? How do you, say there's a Buddhist, there's a Muslim, there's these wonderful, beautiful people with beautiful families in different parts of the world, raised up under a different belief than I was in my Christian community. And why should they not go to their heaven or their belief of heaven or whatever, or have it something, or do you feel like if you don't send a missionary over there to them that they're going to go to hell because we didn't bring them to our way of thinking? Show me the Christian love toward others, and which isn't shown to us in war.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're touching on something that a lot of others have experienced themselves. I read an article recently talking about the shift of the millennials, out of the church and becoming less affiliated, at least with, particular religion. I think they would still consider themselves spiritual, but and anyways, the article what it said was in a way what you're saying, that when it comes to the main reason that the millennials are leaving the church is because of hypocrisy of their parents, and they are disappointed with their church leaders, etc. And so I think the first thing, there's so many ways I would want to respond, but I think the first thing is to go back to Jesus and the resurrection. And I think one of the problems with Christianity in America has been an absolute lack of commitment to actually knowing what Jesus even taught in the first place. And I'm sure many of us here know, people think Republican equals Christian, right? Or people think that being a Christian means going to church, right? They don't read their Bibles, they don't really know who Jesus is. And so I think that one of the main faults of those who failed us, I think it begins not because they knew Jesus, but because they didn't really know Jesus. And I'm not saying this was for your parents. I'm just speaking very generally. And so that's where I would just begin. And then I would say, when you look at Jesus, he does give us something that Buddha and Krishna and Confucius, they don't give us. He says, number one, he speaks into the rejection that we face and the brokenness of our world, and he says, that's real, but it's in all of us. All of us are broken. The reality is, I have a wonderful marriage with my wife, but we're still two sinners, right? There are times when my little children drive me crazy. I'm going to disappoint my kids too. And Jesus speaks into that reality and says, that's true of everyone, right? And then Jesus offers redemption and forgiveness. And in really embracing who Jesus is, I think it does change people from the inside out. And can I speak very quickly, and then I'll let you respond? I've seen this in my family, if I could have a personal testimony. Because as I said, none of us, my parents were not religious at all. I had major family problems with my dad and I. My dad worked. He was gone all the time, worked till he was 40 years old. He retired at 40, came back into my life. I barely even knew my dad. Incredible family tensions. I was very rebellious as a teenager, as I mentioned. What changed us, what healed us was Jesus. It wasn't the church. It was the teachings of Jesus, his forgiveness and his truth. And I would say, begin there. Don't forget about the church. Begin with Jesus. And then let Jesus change you from the inside out.
Do you not have love for a Buddhist and a Muslim?
Of course I do.
Do you believe they're in their right to practice their religion? And if they're in their good beliefs and following those traditions, can we not love them and think that our God is bigger than Christianity, which is merely a religion?
I hate to interrupt. That's a really good question that a lot of people wonder about too. But in the interest of time, Luke, maybe you and she would like to talk afterwards.
No,
Luke
I'm
will be staying
fine.
around.
Thank you. Thanks.
Last question for Valerie.
Thank you. It's a really simple, quick yes or no question. May I have your lemon bar?
Back off.
I'm just kidding. I have another question.
I am the oldest of 6 children, man. You don't mess with my food.
I know. I believe you. I just have a quick question, but I just want to tell you I really appreciate this discussion tonight. I think it's pretty probable that if we were in the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, we would not be able to have this open forum discussion that we're having now. So I really appreciate all your comments, your generosity to one another and to us. I also grew up in the Assemblies of God. I trained to become a pastor in the Assemblies of God. I read 3 of Bart Ehrman's books, so I really appreciate all of his mentions. I recently spent 6 months in the last 2 years in Israel, in the land of Israel. And my question for you is that, for me personally, I didn't come, I consider myself a servant of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who said to Moses at the burning bush that in Hebrew, Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh, which is translated as, I will be who I will be, not what man says I will be. And I consider myself a follower of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And I really appreciate what you said, Luke, that there are not one form of Christianity, there are many forms of Christianities, and therefore I agree, probably based on what was said tonight, I agree with you more, Valerie, than I agree with Luke on probably most things.
Is there a question for Valerie in this?
Sorry, my question is that I did not come to live this life because of I was confirmed without any doubt whatsoever that Jesus rose from the dead, because I wasn't there. I can't know for sure. But why I came to this walk is because my own personal experience, my life testimony of my experience with God. So I have a question for you about a different kind of resurrection. Not instead of the resurrection of Jesus, which none of us could witness or say with complete absolute certainty that we know exactly what happened. We can have faith, we can have trust, all that. But what I want to ask you about is concerning the resurrection of the state of Israel in 1948. This is an event that was prophesied by the prophets of Israel time and time again, one one time after another, that after many years of desolations, after many years of
And the
ruin,
question, I'm sorry.
the question is that how do you explain all the prophecies in the Bible that are being fulfilled one after another in the state of Israel? How would you describe or explain that resurrection that's taking place? Thank you.
The way I explain the fulfillment of prophecy in the Bible is the same way that I would explain the fulfillment of the prophecies of Nostradamus, is the same way that I would explain the fulfillment of horoscopes, to be honest, that there is enough ambiguity in those prophecies that they're kind of open to multiple kinds of interpretation, and that when we are in a confirmatory way rather than a disconfirmatory way, seeking evidence of the fulfillment of prophecy, whether it's kind of short-term predictions or long-term predictions, that if we're looking for confirmation, we tend to find it.
Thank you, Valerie and Luke, for the thoughtful evening you've given us, and especially for the time, effort, and energy you poured into this. This would be a great time to give you applause, which you deserve. And on behalf of everyone who's put this debate together, we want to thank you, the audience. You've been attentive and involved, and we really appreciate that. Remember the refreshment table out there, grab another cookie, but leave another lemon bar for Valerie, please, and watch for the links to the YouTube video that will be posted within a couple weeks. Thank you, and have a good night.